In this podcast episode, Ben Shapiro delves into the ongoing political landscape shaped by former President Donald Trump and tech mogul Elon Musk. The discussion centers around claims of a constitutional crisis by Democrats, the implications of Trump's recent executive actions, and the broader context of governance in America. The podcast opens with a critique of the Democrats' narrative that America is facing a constitutional crisis. Shapiro argues that this rhetoric is a continuation of the previous claims made during the last election cycle, where Trump was labeled a threat to democracy. Shapiro contends that the Democrats have shifted their language from threat to democracy to constitutional crisis as a way to undermine Trump's actions, particularly his recent executive order aimed at rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse in government agencies. Shapiro emphasizes that most Americans do not view Trump's actions as a crisis, citing a recent poll showing his approval ratings at a career high of 53%. The podcast highlights the demographic breakdown of Trump's approval ratings, noting that he enjoys significant support among men, younger voters, and those aged 30 to 49. Shapiro suggests that the American public appreciates Trump's approach to governance, particularly his collaboration with Musk, to audit government agencies and eliminate inefficiencies. This sentiment is contrasted with the Democrats' fear of losing control over a bureaucratic system they have built over decades. The discussion shifts to the concept of the deep state, which Trump has often criticized. Shapiro argues that Trump's efforts to dismantle this entrenched bureaucratic structure resonate with the public, as many Americans are frustrated with government waste. The podcast features Trump's remarks about finding billions in fraud and incompetence within federal agencies, suggesting that any attempt by Democrats to block these efforts would be politically detrimental. Elon Musk's involvement in the Trump administration is a focal point of the conversation. Shapiro describes a recent meeting in the Oval Office where Trump and Musk discussed budget cuts and the need for competence and care in government spending. Musk's transparency and willingness to admit mistakes are highlighted as refreshing qualities in contrast to the previous administration's lack of accountability. The podcast underscores Musk's assertion that bureaucratic inefficiencies hinder democracy, emphasizing the need for a feedback loop between the government and the people. As the conversation progresses, Shapiro addresses the current economic situation in America, noting that inflation remains a pressing issue. The podcast references a report indicating that consumer prices have risen more than expected, prompting discussions about potential interest rate hikes by the Federal Reserve. Shapiro argues that the only way to combat inflation is through increased productivity and cutting waste in government spending. The podcast also touches on the topic of artificial intelligence, AI, and its transformative potential for the economy. Vice President J.D. Vance's remarks at an AI summit in Europe are discussed, emphasizing the need for the U.S. to lead in AI development while warning against overregulation. Shapiro contrasts America's innovative spirit with Europe's more cautious approach, suggesting that the U.S. must capitalize on AI to drive economic growth. The episode highlights significant shifts in corporate policies, particularly at Goldman Sachs and Disney, as they move away from diversity, equity, and inclusion (DEI) initiatives. Shapiro argues that these changes reflect a broader rejection of leftist ideologies in corporate America, driven by public backlash against perceived wokeness. The podcast celebrates these developments as a return to meritocracy, which Shapiro believes will benefit society as a whole. The podcast concludes with a discussion on foreign policy, particularly regarding the release of American hostages from Russia. Shapiro contrasts the Biden administration's handling of hostage situations with Trump's more decisive actions. The recent release of Mark Fogel, an American teacher imprisoned in Russia, is framed as a significant victory for Trump, who welcomed Fogel back to the White House. Shapiro notes that this release may signal a shift in U.S.-Russia relations and highlights the need for a clear strategy in dealing with international conflicts.